Back up. They're not coming. Don't let me die.
You're not dying tonight, not on my watch.
A stormy night. Victor Hale, the billionaire entrepreneur, is driving home from a high-profile meeting when his headlights catch something unusual on the empty road outside the city. A police patrol car, wrecked and overturned, flickers under the rain-soaked streetlights. Victor slows, his gut telling him to drive on, to avoid getting involved. But when he spots the officer lying unconscious next to the wreck, something pulls him out of the car. It's a woman, a black officer, her dark skin streaked with blood. As Victor kneels beside her, her ragged breaths barely audible over the roar of the storm. She whispers with fading strength, "Back up. They're not coming." Victor's eyes narrow. The weight of the situation is clear. She's not just any cop, and he's not just any billionaire. Victor Hale is the picture of success, a wealthy, cold businessman who thrives in the world of high-stakes deals and power moves. Yet beneath the polished exterior lies a man who has buried his past. A man who once saved lives in war zones. A man who never thought he'd get involved in someone else's fight again. But here he is, with the life of Officer Carla Moore in his hands. As the rain beats down, Victor rips his jacket off and cuts her seatbelt, pressing hard on the wound. She looks at him, her eyes glazed, and whispers, "Don't let me die." His calm voice answers, steady but firm, "You're not dying tonight. Not on my watch." If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I'll bring you another story just as crazy as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let's get into it. Victor's life, filled with high-profile deals and power struggles, has always been far from the world of law enforcement. But there's more to Victor Hale than anyone knows. Behind the sharp suits and million-dollar investments is a man with a past that refuses to stay buried. 5 years ago, he was someone else, a combat medic in the Special Forces, the kind of soldier who didn't hesitate when lives were on the line. But everything changed the day his wife, Rachel, was killed in a routine traffic stop. The same cartel Victor fought overseas, the same ruthless criminals, were the ones who had ended her life. Victor walked away from it all, starting over, burying the man he used to be. But now, with a bleeding officer on his hands, fate is pulling him back into the fight. Victor Hale's mind raced, but his hands remained steady. Time was running out. The patrol car was a twisted wreck, its once pristine frame now bent and crumpled under the weight of the crash. The smell of gasoline was thick in the air, mingling with the rain-soaked earth. And every instinct told him to get away, to leave the scene and let the authorities handle it. But that was before he saw the officer, before he saw Carla Moore. She had collapsed in the rain, her dark skin streaked with blood, her body sprawled across the wet pavement. Her uniform, once a symbol of authority, was now torn and stained. The deep gash across her abdomen oozed blood at an alarming rate. Victor kneeled beside her, his mind temporarily shutting off the internal debate that raged inside him. He'd sworn he was done with all this. He'd walked away from the life of a medic, of a soldier, of a man who saved lives under fire. But this was different. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. She was fading, slipping away with every second. Victor could see the life draining from her, every pulse of blood that poured from the wound, a stark reminder that he wasn't going to be able to hold her together for long. He ripped his jacket off, ignoring the chill of the night air against his skin, and leaned over her. With a swift motion, he unsheathed the small tactical knife from his belt, cutting through her seatbelt with the ease of someone who had done this too many times before. It felt almost mechanical. He'd done it in the dark before, many times, saving soldiers, strangers, and sometimes even friends. But this was different. Carla Moore wasn't a soldier. She wasn't some faceless casualty of war. She was someone with a name, a story, and a family who would never understand why she didn't make it out of the night alive. "Stay with me," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The words seemed inadequate, but they were all he could muster. He pressed his hands down on her wound, applying pressure, trying to stem the bleeding. Her body jerked beneath him as she struggled for breath, but her eyes remained locked onto his, full of fear and resignation. "I've seen worse," he said, his voice steady, trying to reassure her, even though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure himself more than her. "You're not dying tonight." Her fingers twitched, her grip weak but persistent. "Back up," she whispered. "Called them 20 minutes ago, but they're not coming." Victor froze for a moment. His hand paused in its frantic motion, his heart hammering in his chest. Someone had already done this to her. Someone had left her to die, thinking she wouldn't make it. He could feel a tightening in his chest. The same tightening he had felt when he lost Rachel. The same feeling of being helpless, powerless to do anything. But that was the old Victor, the man who couldn't save everyone, the man who had learned to walk away. The new Victor didn't walk away. He couldn't. "Then I guess we fight," he muttered under his breath. He glanced at the horizon. The storm was still raging, the night's darkness swallowing the road ahead. He didn't know if help was coming, but he couldn't wait. Not this time. He stood up quickly, scanning his surroundings. The smell of gasoline became stronger, a scent Victor had once known too well. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act, to make sure Carla's injuries didn't worsen, to protect her from the imminent danger of an explosion. He turned and ran to his truck, his feet heavy against the slick ground. Behind the truck's tarp, hidden from sight, was an old military-grade medical kit. It was the kind of kit only someone with Victor's history would keep. He didn't know why he had it, only that it might save someone one day, maybe even him. His mind focused as he retrieved the kit, taking comfort in the weight of the tools. This was his world. This was what he did best. His hands moved with purpose as he returned to Carla. She was still alive, but barely. Blood continued to pour from the wound, and her breathing grew more erratic with each passing second. Victor didn't hesitate. He knelt beside her again, this time pulling open the kit with practiced hands. The gauze, the surgical clamps, the bandages, all tools he'd used countless times under fire, stitched in the dark while bullets whizzed overhead. But none of those times had felt like this. This time, he wasn't fighting a war. He wasn't saving a comrade in arms. He was saving a woman who had put her life on the line to protect people like him. "Hang on, Carla. Talk to me," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Tell me why you became a cop." She tried to smile, but winced in pain. "Wanted to make a difference." Victor's fingers tightened on the gauze, packing it into her wound. He worked fast, his training kicking in, his hands steady despite the blood soaking his fingers. "Good reason," he said. "We could all use a little more of that." She groaned, clearly struggling to stay awake, but Victor didn't let up. "Stay with me," he repeated, his voice firm though his heart ached. There was no time for softness. Not now. Carla's eyes fluttered closed for a brief moment, and Victor's heart skipped a beat. But then her hand found his arm, her grip weak but determined. You'll be all right," she whispered, hurt you too? You've got to go. Victor paused, looking down at her in disbelief. Not happening, he said quietly, his voice holding a thread of conviction. I'm not leaving you. Not like this. He stood, shifting her gently in his arms. She gasped in pain, but didn't protest. On 3, Victor murmured, as he carefully adjusted his grip. 1, 2, 3. He hoisted her carefully, her weight light in his arms, but every step he took felt like a marathon. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her body jerking slightly with each step, but he kept moving. The wreckage was too close. The gas fumes were thick in the air, and the thought of an explosion, of a spark igniting the leaking fuel, kept pushing him forward. Every instinct he had, every fiber of his being, screamed that he had to move faster. They reached what he estimated to be a safe distance, at least 20 or 30 feet from the wreckage. The adrenaline coursing through his veins made it feel like he could run forever, but his legs were shaking with exhaustion. Dana, still alive but barely, needed help. She needed a hospital. Behind them, the wrecked patrol car began to sputter and spark, a low whine of the engine grinding to life. And then, boom! The explosion shook the ground beneath them, and Victor threw himself over Carla, shielding her from the blast. The force of the explosion sent a wave of heat and debris crashing over them, but Victor held her tightly, keeping her safe from the worst of it. He could feel the sharp sting of shrapnel hitting the ground around them, but he didn't move. When the dust settled, the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, masking the sound of the crackling fire. Victor pulled away slowly, checking Carla's wounds again, making sure she was still alive. Her pulse was weak but steady, and the bleeding had slowed. "You're insane," she murmured, her voice hoarse, a small, pained smile on her lips. Victor allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "I get that a lot." He checked his phone, still no signal. There was no time to wait for help. He had to move fast. She couldn't walk, but he couldn't carry her much further. The road was only half a mile away, uphill through the forest. He was exhausted, but he knew he had no choice. "Can you move?" he asked. Carla looked up at him, her eyes glassy but determined. "I don't know." "Then you'll have to try," he said gently, but with authority. "On 3, he added. She nodded, and together they made it to their feet. As Victor began to carry her, the rain falling steadily around them, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something bigger, something that would pull him back into a fight he had hoped to leave behind. But he had no choice. Not this time. Not when a life was on the line. Not when it was hers. Victor Hale's boots sank into the wet ground as he carried Officer Carla Moore across the rain-soaked forest floor. The weight of the world was on his shoulders, literally and figuratively. Every step was a struggle. Her breath, shallow and labored, echoed in his ears as he moved through the darkness. The forest, once quiet and still, now felt alive with the threat of danger. They had to get to the road. The longer they stayed in this remote patch of land, the closer the cartel would come. They weren't the only ones who knew Carla had survived. If they didn't get to help soon, her chances of survival would diminish. And if the cartel had eyes on them, there was no guarantee they'd make it out alive. Victor's thoughts raced, but his movements were deliberate. Each step took effort, his body screaming from exhaustion, but he couldn't afford to slow down. Carla had trusted him, and now it was his turn to make sure she made it out of this alive. They were 30 feet from the road when Carla's eyes fluttered open again. Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but there was a note of urgency in it. Why did you stop? Victor paused, glancing down at her. She was fighting to stay conscious, the strain evident on her face. Because you needed help, Victor replied, his voice steady despite the situation. That's what anyone should do. Carla shook her head, her breath catching. It's not that simple. You could have driven away, saved yourself. Victor didn't answer immediately. He could have. He had every reason to keep driving, to leave her behind, just like the world had left him behind years ago. But when he saw her, lying there in the rain, bleeding out, something inside him snapped. He wasn't that man anymore. He couldn't just turn away from someone who needed help. I don't walk away from people who need help, he said finally. Not anymore. Her eyes closed for a moment, and Victor moved faster, knowing they were running out of time. The road was within sight, but he could already hear the sound of approaching footsteps. Someone was coming. Victor hoped it was a passing truck, a good Samaritan, someone who could help. He didn't have the strength to carry Carla much farther. Just as they reached the road, Victor spotted headlights cutting through the rain. Relief flooded through him. They weren't alone anymore. He laid Carla gently on the damp ground and stepped into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically to flag down the truck. The vehicle slowed, then stopped, and the driver rolled down the window. The driver, an older black man with a graying beard, peered out at Victor and Carla with concern. What happened to her? She's a cop, Victor said quickly. She's hurt. We need to get her to the hospital. The man nodded, stepping out of the truck. His face was creased with the weariness of age, but his eyes were sharp, filled with a sense of quiet determination. Get her in the back. I'll take you. Victor helped Carla into the truck's back seat, trying his best not to jostle her too much. The man slammed the door shut and climbed into the driver's seat, shifting the truck into gear. As they pulled away, Victor looked back at the forest one last time. It was dark, but he knew the cartel was out there, watching. The drive to the hospital felt like it lasted an eternity, but in reality, it was only a matter of minutes. By the time they arrived, the storm was subsiding, but the tension in Victor's chest remained. He helped the driver load Carla into a gurney, rushing her inside to the waiting medical team. Victor stood back, his mind still running through everything that had happened. His heart hammered in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly alive again. This wasn't a case of saving someone on the battlefield. This was real life, and he was still in it. A nurse approached him, offering him a towel. You need to clean up. You're covered in blood. Victor took the towel, wiping his hands, trying to make sense of the chaotic rush of emotions that swirled within him. How is she? He asked, his voice barely audible. She's in surgery now. It's a long shot, but she's stable for now, the nurse replied. You saved her life. Victor nodded, staring at the door where Carla had been wheeled through. He wasn't a hero. He didn't need praise. But the feeling of saving a life, of doing something good for someone else. It was a feeling he hadn't known in a long time. Victor sat in a sterile hospital waiting room, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead mixing with the low murmur of other visitors in the room. His hands trembled slightly as he glanced at his watch. Carla had been in surgery for what felt like an eternity, and he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. He knew her chances were slim, but he had to believe she'd make it through. A voice broke through his thoughts. Mr. Hale? Victor looked up to see a tall, dark-skinned man standing before him, dressed in a police uniform. His face was serious, and the weight of authority hung heavily in his posture. Yes? Victor replied, standing up and wiping his palms on his pants. I'm Captain Raymond Holt, the man said, extending his hand. I'm the head of the department here. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for Officer Moore. Victor shook his hand, though his mind was still elsewhere, focused on Carla's survival. I just did what anyone would have done. Captain Holt nodded, but studied him more closely. What you did was more than just anyone would do. Your medical skills? They're impressive. What unit were you with? Victor hesitated, wondering how much to say. He'd left that life behind. Didn't need anyone digging into his past, but the captain's piercing gaze told him that there was no easy way to avoid the question. I used to be a medic, Victor said quietly, his eyes drifting to the door where Carla had been wheeled in. Special Forces. The captain's eyebrows raised. Special Forces? So this isn't your first time saving someone? Victor shrugged, trying to keep his emotions in check. It's been a while. I left the service a few years ago. Captain Holt studied him for a moment, the weight of the question hanging between them. I need to ask you something, Mr. Hale. What do you know about the cartel? Officer Moore was investigating a connection, and it looks like you might have just saved her from them. Victor stiffened. I don't know anything about that. But the captain wasn't convinced. I think you do, he said, his tone shifting. This is bigger than just Officer Moore's injury. The cartel's been active here for years, and I've got a feeling you might be the key to stopping them. Victor's heart skipped a beat. The last thing he wanted was to be dragged back into that world, the world he'd fought to leave behind. He didn't need to get involved. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. But the thought of Carla lying in surgery because of these criminals changed something in him. Maybe fate had decided for him. I'm not getting involved in this, Victor said, his voice firm, but his eyes were on the door. Not unless it's to make sure she makes it through. Captain Holt nodded slowly, as though he understood something Victor hadn't said. I'll be in touch, he said, before turning and walking away. Victor sat back down in the waiting room, the heavy silence surrounding him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to go back to that world, if he even could. But as the hours stretched on and the weight of the night's events sank in, one thing became clear. He wasn't walking away from this fight. Not this time. Victor sat in the waiting room, the sterile white walls closing in around him. The hospital, despite its bright lights and busy atmosphere, felt suffocating. He was alone, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. His mind kept replaying the moment when he had saved Carla. The blood, the rain, the explosion. It all felt like a dream, something too wild to be real. But it was real. And now he had to face the consequences. He had thought, when he saved Carla, that he would return to his quiet life, that he could walk away from this. He had done his part. But the call of duty, the need to help, was still buried deep inside him. Mr. Hale? Victor looked up as a nurse approached, her face serious. She handed him a clipboard. Officer Moore is stable. You can see her now, but there's someone else who wants to speak with you. Victor's stomach tightened. He knew who it was before the nurse even finished speaking. Captain Holt? The nurse nodded and stepped aside. Victor didn't have time to respond. He followed the nurse down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. The familiar weight of tension settled back into his chest. He wasn't ready for this conversation, but he didn't have much choice. As they reached Carla's room, the door was slightly ajar. Victor saw the faint silhouette of Captain Raymond Holt, standing by the window, his posture rigid, staring out into the night. Captain, Victor said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "I didn't expect to see you here." Holt turned slowly, his expression unreadable. He was an imposing man. Tall, graying at the temples, his uniform sharp and crisp despite the late hour. His eyes were focused, intense, like a man who'd seen the worst of the world and still managed to keep it together. "I thought we should talk," Holt replied, his tone calm but firm. "About Officer Moore's case and, well, about you." Victor stepped into the room, glancing briefly at Carla. She was hooked up to various machines, her face pale, but she was breathing steadily. That was a good sign. "What about me?" Victor asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not blind, Mr. Hale," Holt said, stepping closer. "I saw what you did for Officer Moore. You're no ordinary civilian. I've been in this business long enough to recognize military training when I see it. You didn't just save her life. You're too calm under pressure. You didn't panic. You knew exactly what to do." Victor didn't answer right away. He wasn't here to make friends with the police. He wasn't here to explain himself. But there was a part of him, buried deep down, that respected Holt's honesty. The man wasn't wasting time with pleasantries. He was cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "What's your point, Captain?" Victor asked, his voice low. Holt took a deep breath and looked at Carla one last time before turning back to Victor. "I've been investigating a string of cartel-related incidents here in the city. Officer Moore was following a lead when she got ambushed. It wasn't just a random attack. She was onto something. Something big." Victor's heart sank. His gut twisted as he thought about the cartel. The same cartel that had destroyed his life 5 years ago. He had left that world behind. But now, it seemed like the world wasn't done with him yet. "Is that why you're here, Captain?" Victor's voice was cold, betraying the unease he felt. "Because you think I can help you with the cartel?" Holt's expression didn't change. He stepped closer to Victor, lowering his voice. "I think you know more than you're letting on. Your military record is classified, but I've seen enough to know that you've been to places that don't show up on maps. You've dealt with operations like this before. You've faced this kind of enemy." Victor crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "I don't do that anymore. I'm done." "You think you're done?" Holt's voice was sharp, piercing the silence. "This cartel, these criminals, they don't care who you are or what you've left behind. They'll keep coming, and you'll keep running. But you can stop them. You have the skills. You've already shown me that." Victor shook his head, stepping away. "I'm not getting involved in this. I saved Officer Moore because it was the right thing to do. But I'm not some hired gun." Holt's gaze softened, but there was still an edge to it. "You're not a hired gun, Victor. You're a man who knows what it means to lose someone you love to people like this. You've seen the worst of them, and now you can stop them. The question is, are you going to walk away, or are you going to fight?" Victor's mind raced. He could feel the weight of Holt's words pulling at him. And for the first time in a long time, the old Victor, the one who had once fought battles for a living, came to the surface. "Let me be clear," Victor said, turning to face the captain. "I'm not joining your fight. I'm not going after the cartel. But if you need help in a tactical capacity, if you need someone who knows how to survive and make sure others do, then I'll help. But I'm not carrying a weapon. I'm not going back into that world." Holt's eyes narrowed, but he nodded slowly. "I can work with that. Just make sure you're ready when we need you." Victor took a deep breath, his decision made. He had no intention of going back to the chaos. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure no one else suffered the way Rachel had. And if that meant helping the police bring down the cartel, he would. "I'll do what I can," Victor said, his voice steady now. But no promises. Victor left the hospital hours later, his mind still swirling with everything that had transpired. As he sat in his car, staring out at the dark streets of the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled back into a life he had fought so hard to escape. But his daughter, Maria, needed him. And if he could stop this cartel from destroying more lives, he would. For her. For the world he wanted to give her. For the woman he used to be. The one who didn't turn away from danger. He glanced down at his wrist, where the black rubber bracelet that had once been his only connection to his past now felt like a weight. It wasn't a reminder anymore. It was a promise. "Never leave a fallen," he muttered to himself. And as he drove through the rain-soaked streets, he knew that whatever happened next, this fight was no longer just about surviving. It was about making sure no one else fell. The rain had stopped, but the weight of the storm still hung in the air. Victor drove through the quiet streets, his mind replaying everything he'd heard from Captain Holt earlier. The cartel, the corruption within the force, and the promise he made to Carla to help in any way he could. He had already made the decision not to go back into the field, but the pull of duty, of wanting to stop these criminals before they took any more lives, was harder to ignore than he'd hoped. Victor pulled into his driveway, the headlights of his SUV illuminating the small house he'd called home for the last 5 years. The world outside was peaceful, almost serene in its silence. But he knew better. He had seen enough to know that the quiet was just the calm before the storm. He glanced at the front door as he got out of the car. Maria, his 10-year-old daughter, was likely already in bed. She had that look in her eyes lately. The one where she could tell something was off, but was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening. He had tried to shield her from the darkness of the world, but that wasn't always possible. As he walked toward the door, he caught a movement in the corner of his eye. A shadow. It was fleeting, but it was enough to make his hand instinctively fall to his side, his fingers brushing against the old tactical knife he kept in the truck. He paused, his senses alert. Something was wrong. Victor turned the corner of the house, his steps silent. That's when he saw it. 2 men standing at the back of his property, their faces masked in the shadows. One of them was tall, with a heavy build. The other shorter, but with a quick, deliberate gait. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a familiar chill run down his spine. Without thinking, Victor made his way to the back door, slipping inside silently and reaching for the phone. He needed to call Holt, but before he could dial, a knock on the front door broke the silence of the house. Victor froze. He hadn't heard anyone approaching, and he certainly wasn't expecting visitors. He moved quickly, stealthily, toward the front of the house, keeping his back pressed to the wall. As he peered through the window, he saw a black sedan parked outside, the engine running, headlights dimmed. He didn't need to think twice. He knew who it was. He opened the door just a crack, enough to catch the eyes of 2 men in suits, their faces grim. "Mr. Hale," one of them said, his tone flat but professional. "We need to talk." Victor stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. He wasn't in the mood for games. "Who are you?" "We're from the department," the other man spoke up. "We need your cooperation." Victor narrowed his eyes. He hadn't trusted the police since everything went to hell with Rachel. The last thing he needed was more questions, more problems. He knew this wasn't about Carla. This was about something far deeper, far more dangerous. I've already spoken to Captain Holt, Victor said. I don't have anything else to add. The first man stepped forward, his hand reaching for his jacket pocket. That's not exactly true, is it? We know about your military record, Mr. Hale. Special Forces, Silver Star, combat medic. Victor tensed, his stomach sinking. He had known it was only a matter of time before someone dug into his past. But hearing it out loud made it real. He could feel the weight of his past pressing in on him. They had found out more than he'd expected. I don't know what you think you know, Victor said, his voice low, calm, but I'm not interested in rehashing old stories. The second man stepped in. The problem is, Mr. Hale, you're involved whether you like it or not. You've seen the corruption within the force. You've seen what they've done. You can't walk away from this anymore. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping to stay out of the mess, but it was clear now that the cartel was just one part of a larger, more insidious issue. These men weren't just here to ask questions. They were here because they wanted something from him. Something he wasn't ready to give. I'm not the one who can fix this, Victor said. You want someone to fight your battles? You need to find someone else. One of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folder. He opened it, revealing a series of photos. Each one was a snapshot of the chaos Victor had tried to escape. The drug cartel's influence, the dirty cops, the faces of men who had used and abused their power without a second thought. One photo in particular caught Victor's attention. A picture of a man. The same man who had ambushed Carla. He recognized the tattoos on his neck, the cold, calculating eyes. This is who you're up against, Mr. Hale, the first man said, tapping the photo with his finger. You've already saved one of our own. But now, you're going to help us clean this up, whether you want to or not. Victor stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about saving Carla anymore. This was about stopping a war that had already claimed too many lives. The man in the photo, the one Victor had seen in the shadows, was someone he knew all too well. A name from his past, a name that had haunted his every move since Rachel's death. But before he could respond, there was a noise from behind him. A sound. Faint, but unmistakable. Footsteps. He turned quickly, his instincts kicking in just as the back door slammed open. His body reacted on autopilot, his hand reaching for the knife at his side as the two men in front of him scrambled to draw their guns. The door opened, and through the doorway, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was Captain Holt. Get away from him, Holt barked, his gun drawn, aimed at the two men. The atmosphere shifted immediately. There was no mistaking Holt's intent. Victor could barely breathe as the tension in the room escalated. The two men dropped their guns, hands raised in surrender, but their faces remained calm. Too calm. We don't want any trouble, the second man said, his voice a little less confident now. We're just doing our job. Holt's eyes never left the men as he motioned for Victor to step back. Who sent you? We're just doing what we were told, the first man repeated. Your department's got a lot of questions, Hale, and some people want answers. Victor felt the world slow around him. There it was. The betrayal, plain as day. They weren't working for the department. They were working for someone higher up. Someone who didn't care about the law. Someone who was in deep with the cartel. Before Victor could respond, Holt barked an order. Take them in. The two men exchanged a quick, panicked glance, but they didn't resist. They had no choice. Later that night, Victor sat in his living room, his head spinning. Holt had taken the two men into custody, but the question still lingered. This wasn't just about the cartel anymore. This was bigger. This was about power, control, and the corruption that had reached into every corner of the system Victor had once trusted. As the clock ticked on, Victor felt the weight of the decision he had made. He had crossed a line. But now that he was in, there was no going back. The fight wasn't just about saving Carla or stopping the cartel. It was about exposing a truth that could shake everything to its core. The following morning, Victor sat in his small kitchen, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him as he stared out the window. The rain had stopped, but the weight of what had transpired still pressed heavily on his chest. The events of the previous night played through his mind. The confrontation at his doorstep, the men who had shown up uninvited, and the betrayal he had uncovered. He had known there was something off about the situation, but now it was clear. This wasn't just about saving a life anymore. This was about exposing a system so broken that it had allowed men like the ones who showed up at his house to thrive in the shadows. Victor's eyes shifted to the framed photo of Maria, his daughter, sitting on the kitchen counter. She was the reason he had left that life behind, the reason he had buried his past. He wasn't supposed to get involved in anything dangerous anymore, wasn't supposed to be the man who took on the world's problems. But everything had changed when he saw Carla, injured and alone, clinging to life. He had made a promise to himself that he would never go back to that world. But here he was, stepping further into it, one decision at a time. The knock on his door startled him from his thoughts. Victor stood, his hand instinctively going to the knife hidden in his jacket pocket. He knew who it was before he even opened the door. It was Captain Holt. "Mr. Hale," Holt said, as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I need to talk." Victor didn't bother with pleasantries. "I assume this is about last night." Holt gave a short nod, his face stern. "It's bigger than that." Victor's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Holt paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "We're dealing with something far more dangerous than we realized." "The two men you encountered last night? They weren't just hired goons. They were sent by someone higher up. Someone connected directly to the cartel. And it's not just about drugs. There's a whole network of people, politicians, businessmen, and even some of our own officers who are involved." Victor's stomach tightened at the mention of the officers. He had suspected it, but hearing it out loud was a different matter entirely. "So, what's the plan? You arrest these guys, and everything goes back to normal?" Holt shook his head, his expression darkening. "No. The corruption runs too deep. We need more than just arrests. We need someone on the inside, someone who understands how they think, someone who can expose this network from the inside out." Victor clenched his fists, his jaw setting. "And you think that's me?" Holt met his gaze with a look that said everything. "I think you're the only one who can." Victor's mind raced. He had hoped to walk away, to live a quiet life with his daughter, to never again face the kind of danger he had walked away from years ago. But now, with everything on the line, he realized that wasn't possible. The only way to stop this, to protect the people he cared about, was to step back into the world he had left behind. "I'm not going into the field," Victor said firmly. "I made that clear last night." "You won't have to," Holt replied quickly. "You'll be a consultant. You'll help us analyze their operations, give us the tactical insight we need to infiltrate this network. But you stay out of the direct action." Victor hesitated. The part of him that had walked away from the chaos, the violence, and the destruction screamed at him to walk away again. But then he thought of Carla, lying in the hospital, and of his wife, Rachel, who had died because of the same cartel. This wasn't just about helping the police. This was personal. "I don't carry a weapon," Victor said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'll help, if you need me." Holt nodded. "Good, because I'm going to need you." The next day, Victor arrived at the police department's makeshift operations center, located in a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only came from too many secrets and too few answers. Officers moved with purpose, their eyes sharp as they pored over maps and reports, making plans to take down the cartel and the corrupt officers within their ranks. Victor stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. It was familiar. The focused energy, the rush of adrenaline, the sense of urgency. It was like stepping into a world he had once known so well. But there was something different about it now. This wasn't the battlefield. This was the fight for survival. And the stakes were higher than ever. Captain Holt approached him as soon as he entered, his face grim. "You're just in time. We have a meeting with the task force in 30 minutes. You'll be sitting in. We need your expertise on how to deal with cartel tactics." Victor nodded, his mind already working. "What do you know so far?" "We've got intel on the main players," Holt said, leading Victor over to a large table covered with maps and photos. "But we're not sure who's in charge. We think it's a man named Rafael Cortez, but we don't have confirmation. His cartel is involved in everything: drugs, human trafficking, extortion. But we're also seeing signs that some of our own are involved." Victor's mind sharpened at the mention of Cortez. The name rang a bell. He had heard it before, years ago, back when he was still in the field. Cortez was a name feared by many, a man who operated in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. He had disappeared for years, but the fact that his cartel was still active in the area wasn't surprising. What was surprising was that the officers working on this case were being targeted, taken out one by one. "Cortez is still active," Victor said, more to himself than to Holt. "And he's more dangerous than we thought. We think he's operating out of a warehouse near the old industrial district," Holt said. "It's heavily guarded, but we've got a plan to take it down. We'll need your insight on how to approach this without getting caught in a trap." Victor studied the map on the table, his mind working quickly. He had been in situations like this before, with little information and even less time. But this was different. This wasn't a foreign battlefield. This was his home, and these people were his responsibility. "I'll help," Victor said finally, his voice low. "But we need to be prepared. If Cortez is involved, this isn't going to be a clean operation. It's going to get ugly." Later that night, Victor sat in the back of a mobile command center, his eyes fixed on the screens in front of him as the task force moved into position. He had spent the day reviewing intel, running through tactical scenarios, and making sure the officers were as prepared as they could be. The raid was imminent. They had to move fast, or they risked losing their chance to take down the cartel. The atmosphere inside the command vehicle was tense. Holt stood beside him, his eyes flicking between the screens and the operation team communicating over the radio. Victor knew this wasn't just another operation. This was their one shot at bringing the cartel down and ending the corruption within the force. "Team 1 in position," came the voice over the radio. "Team 2 ready, Team 3 holding." Victor's eyes narrowed as he studied the layout of the warehouse. It was a fortress. He had seen enough of these to know that they would need more than just brute force to take it down. "They'll run for the back exit," Victor said, his voice steady. "It's the only way out. Keep Team 3 back. If we trap them in there, we can cut off their escape. Holt turned to him, surprised. How do you know that? Because it's what they always do, Victor replied, his mind working through the possibilities. They'll know the second we breach the front door. They'll try to escape through the back. The plan was set. The task force moved into position and the operation began. Flashbangs exploded, voices rang out, and chaos ensued. Victor watched the raid unfold, his eyes glued to the monitors. The operation was moving faster than expected, but there was no time for mistakes. The cartel members were cornered. Cortez was close. Then, over the radio, a voice shouted, "Cortez has explosives. He's got a detonator." Victor's mind raced. He had been right. They were running out of time. The explosion was just a moment away. "Take the shot," Victor ordered. "Now." The operation had been a success. Barely. The warehouse was secure, the cartel members arrested, and the explosives diffused. But for Victor, the feeling of relief was fleeting. He had been in combat situations countless times, but this felt different. The stakes were higher than ever, and as the adrenaline wore off, a cold, uneasy calm settled over him. Victor stood near the edge of the crime scene, watching as officers cuffed the last of the cartel members. Their leader, Rafael Cortez, was still unconscious, a victim of the clean shot Dana had taken just moments before. She had been on point, following Victor's instructions like a seasoned tactical expert. But even though the operation had gone as planned, something in the pit of his stomach told him they hadn't won yet. Holt approached, his face lined with exhaustion but relief in his eyes. "It's done," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've taken them down." Victor nodded but didn't respond right away. His thoughts were still on the field, still reviewing every step, every movement, every near miss. He knew better than anyone that just because you won one battle didn't mean the war was over. There were always more enemies, always more forces working behind the scenes. "Cortez is out of commission for now," Holt continued, his voice carrying the weight of both success and something unspoken. "But the rest of the cartel, they're still out there. We've got a long way to go." Victor turned, his eyes meeting Holt's. There was a spark in the captain's gaze, a glimmer of respect that hadn't been there before. They had just completed one of the most dangerous operations Victor had been a part of in years, but for all their success, they knew it was only a small piece of the puzzle. "You've done good work, Hale," Holt said, his voice steady but sincere. "I don't say this lightly. We wouldn't have made it through this operation without you." Victor said nothing. His mind was already elsewhere. He had done what was necessary, but that wasn't what haunted him. What haunted him was the fact that he had put Carla in harm's way. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and though he had saved her life, the scars of this night would stay with her forever. As they began to clear the warehouse, Victor turned and walked toward a quieter part of the compound. The familiar sting of old memories gnawed at him, dragging him back to that night, the night he lost Rachel. The night the cartel had taken everything from him. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they wouldn't go. They never did. Carla was recovering, but Victor couldn't shake the feeling that she was only alive because of him. She owed him her life, but there was no debt between them. She didn't need that. He had done what he had to do because it was the right thing. But now, as the echoes of the operation faded, the reality of what they had uncovered started to sink in. There was still so much work to do. Later that night, debriefing room. The debriefing room was filled with the quiet murmur of officers discussing the raid's successes and the aftermath. The air was thick with tension, but there was also an undeniable sense of accomplishment. The mission had been dangerous, but it had gone off without a hitch. As Victor stood in the corner of the room, he observed the conversations, his mind already sorting through the next steps, the next phase of the fight. Holt stood at the front, holding the floor. "We've got Cortez in custody. The rest of the cartel is on the run, but we've hit them hard. Our next step is to move quickly, cut off their supply lines, and get to the men behind the scenes. We can't let them regroup." Victor crossed his arms, standing silently at the back of the room. But his thoughts were elsewhere. Every word Holt said was important. But the pieces of the puzzle didn't quite add up. They had taken down one part of the cartel, but the system was so much larger than that. There were still powerful players behind the scenes, men who had the resources to stay hidden for years. And they weren't going down without a fight. As the meeting broke up, Holt walked over to Victor, his expression grim. "We've made progress," Holt said. "But there's more to this than just dismantling the cartel. We've got officers inside who are compromised. The network we're dealing with is more entrenched than we thought. We need someone who knows how they think." Victor's jaw tightened. He knew where this conversation was going. He had tried to stay out of it. He had tried to walk away, to remain just a consultant. But Holt was right. They couldn't do this without him. Not now. "I'm not going back into the field," Victor said, his voice low but firm. "You don't have to," Holt replied. "I need you to help us figure out what's next. We need someone who can analyze their tactics, their moves. You've seen this before. You know how they operate. You're the only one who can help us stay one step ahead." Victor looked at Holt, his mind racing. This wasn't the life he had chosen. This wasn't the future he had promised himself. But in that moment, he realized that he didn't have a choice. The fight was far from over. And if he wanted to stop these criminals from destroying more lives, he was going to have to take part in it. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decision settling over him. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll help. But only in an advisory role. No field work, no weapons. I'll analyze their movements. That's it." Holt nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's all I need, Victor. We'll take it from here. But I'm glad you're with us." Victor nodded, but didn't smile. There was no time for smiles. This was just the beginning, and there was much more to come. 3 days later, in the field, Victor stood in the mobile command center, watching the operation unfold before him. This wasn't the chaos of the battlefield. It wasn't the noise of war. But it was close. Officers moved with precision, communicating through their earpieces, their every move calculated and purposeful. The raid on the warehouse was going as planned. But Victor knew better than anyone that plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. The task force had set up a perimeter around the building, and Victor could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just another bust. This was the culmination of everything they had worked for. The chance to strike a blow against the cartel and take down the corruption within their own ranks. Victor's role was simple. Observe. Analyze. Make sure the operation stayed on track. But as the operation began, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cartel was good at hiding, good at blending into the shadows. They had been doing it for years. Victor scanned the monitors, his eyes narrowing as he noticed something. A movement at the rear of the warehouse. A faint flicker of motion that didn't belong. It wasn't enough to be a threat, but it was enough to raise the hairs on the back of his neck. "Captain," he said, his voice steady as he spoke into the radio. Team 3 needs to move back. They're setting up for a rear exit. Holt's voice crackled over the radio. Copy that, Victor. Team 3, hold back. Stay in position. Victor watched as the officers adjusted their formation, taking the advice seriously. It was a small adjustment, but it made all the difference. Within minutes, the rear exit was breached, and cartel members attempted to flee. Victor's eyes never left the screen as the chaos of the operation unfolded. Flashbangs went off, and gunfire echoed in the distance. But in the end, it was the tactical advantage they had gained from Victor's insight that made the operation a success. They cornered the cartel members, arrested them without casualties, and moved in quickly to seize their assets. As the dust settled, Holt stepped into the command center, his expression one of quiet triumph. We did it, Holt said, offering Victor a nod of respect. This operation wouldn't have been as smooth without you. Victor didn't smile, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were finally getting closer to ending this war. Victor walked out of the mobile command center, his eyes scanning the scene around him. The operation had been a success, but as the night wore on, a growing sense of unease lingered in the air. The officers, who had been so focused and determined moments ago, were now cleaning up, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The high of victory was short-lived, but it was the price of victory that weighed on Victor's mind. Despite the success of the raid, despite the fact that they had seized weapons, drugs, and captured cartel members, there was something deeper, something more insidious at play. The corruption within the department, the officers who were part of the cartel's operations, was still a threat. The network ran deeper than anyone realized. The night's victory was only the first step in what was sure to be a long and dangerous journey. Victor's thoughts were interrupted as Holt approached, his face a grim mask of concentration. He didn't look victorious. He looked like a man who had been fighting a battle for years and knew the fight wasn't over. You did good tonight, Holt said, his voice low and tired. But it's not over. We've got a lot more work ahead of us. Victor nodded, but said nothing. He didn't need to be told that. He could feel it too. The web of corruption had only been slightly untangled, but there was more to uncover, and the danger wasn't over yet. The cartel wasn't the only enemy they had to worry about. Some of the officers who had turned a blind eye to the cartel's activities still lurked within the department. And that was a problem that went beyond tactical analysis and combat strategies. We need to go after the rest of them, Holt continued, his voice tight. But we can't do this alone. We need someone who knows how to fight this kind of battle. We need someone who knows how the cartel works, and someone who's seen the worst of it. Victor's gaze hardened. He knew exactly where this conversation was going. The question had already been asked before, but now it was more pressing. He had hoped to stay on the sidelines, to keep his involvement to a minimum, but every step they took only brought him deeper into the mess. There was no going back. You're not asking for my help in a tactical role anymore, Victor said, his voice firm. You want me to go after them. Holt didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at Victor, the weight of the decision in his eyes. The department can't do it alone. You've got the skills we need. You've been there. You've seen how they operate. Victor's heart clenched as he thought of Rachel, the woman he had lost to this very cartel. The same men who had taken her life were still out there, still running the show, and the thought of going after them again filled him with a mix of anger and fear. I'm not going back into the field, Victor said, his voice unwavering. I can analyze their movements. I can help you plan. But I'm not going after them. Not like before. Holt took a deep breath, his expression softening for just a moment. I know what this means for you, Victor. You've already lost enough. But this is bigger than just you. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than Carla. The whole city is at risk. These men don't just run drugs. They run everything. Victor turned away from him, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel the weight of Holt's words pressing down on him. They weren't just fighting the cartel. They were fighting an entire system of corruption, something that had festered in the shadows for years. This was personal, and Victor knew deep down that he couldn't walk away from it now. He didn't have to think for long. His decision was already made. He had crossed the line when he saved Carla. He had crossed the line the moment he stepped back into this fight. There was no turning back. I'll help, Victor said quietly, turning back to face Holt. But not in the field. I'll work with you, train your officers. I'll provide the intel, the tactics. But I'm not going after them with a gun in my hand. Holt nodded, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Fair enough. We'll take what we can get. But we're in this together, Victor. And if things get worse, we'll need you in the thick of it. Victor exhaled slowly, his mind already preparing for what was to come. I'm not going back to that life. But I'll do what I can. For the city. For my daughter. For the people who deserve to live without fear. Later that night, Victor didn't sleep much that night. His mind raced, turning over the events of the day, of the raid, of the enemies they had captured. But in the quiet of the night, his thoughts kept returning to the deeper issue, one that no one seemed ready to face yet. The corruption within the police department. The officers who were as much a part of the cartel as the criminals they were supposed to fight. Victor knew that as long as those officers were still in power, as long as the corruption was allowed to fester, the fight wouldn't end. The city would continue to suffer, and there would always be a new cartel to replace the old one. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the black bracelet on his wrist. The words were faded now, barely visible against the rubber. Never leave a fallen. The words that had once been his guiding principle. The words that had kept him going when everything seemed lost. Victor touched the bracelet lightly, feeling the cool rubber against his skin. The promise he had made to himself to never leave anyone behind was still alive in him. It wasn't about glory or revenge. It was about making sure that the people who needed protecting, the ones who couldn't protect themselves, were safe. And that meant stopping the men who ran this city from the shadows. He stood up, moving to the window and looking out at the dark, silent streets. Tomorrow, the task force would move forward. Tomorrow, they would try to take down the rest of the cartel. Tomorrow, Victor would take the first step in a fight that would change everything. 3 days later, Victor sat in the briefing room, surrounded by officers who had been part of the raid. Holt stood at the front, his gaze sweeping across the room as he prepared to speak. "We've made progress," Holt said, his voice steady, "but we're far from done. We know who's behind this, and we know we're not the only ones after them. We've been tracking movements, gathering intel, and the next step is taking down the rest of the cartel. But this isn't going to be easy. We have to work together, and we have to be smart about it." Victor nodded, standing at the back of the room, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. He wasn't going into the field. He wasn't going to carry a weapon. But he would provide the insights, the guidance, and the expertise that would help the officers survive the coming fight. He wasn't a soldier anymore. But he was still a protector. and that's all that mattered now. The days blurred together after the operation, and for Victor, the pressure only increased. The task force had been relentless in its pursuit of the cartel, but as they dismantled one piece of the network, they uncovered even more. It wasn't just the drugs or weapons that kept this criminal organization alive. It was the money, the influence, and most chillingly, the corruption within the police force. They weren't just fighting criminals. They were fighting a system that had been broken for far too long. Victor had kept his distance from the front lines, remaining in the background, offering his expertise in tactical medicine, analyzing cartel movements, and reviewing intelligence. It was a role he could handle, one that kept him out of harm's way and away from the life he had left behind. But it was also a role that kept him at the center of the storm. A storm that seemed to grow darker with every passing day. Now, as he sat in the small, dimly lit command room, surrounded by officers who looked to him for answers, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him. He had agreed to help, but he hadn't expected it to pull him in so deeply. The stakes were higher now, too high for him to walk away. "We've got a lead on one of the major players," Holt said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. He stood at the front of the room, a map of the city pinned to the wall behind him, markers indicating cartel hotspots and known associates. "We've narrowed it down to a warehouse on the edge of town. We think it's where the cartel's financial operations are being run." Victor leaned forward, his eyes scanning the map. "What's the plan?" "We hit it hard," Holt replied. "We move in with the task force, take them down quickly and decisively. But we need to be sure. If we move too fast, we risk losing them again." Victor ran his fingers through his hair, thinking, "You're not going to catch them with force alone. They'll be expecting that. You need a diversion, something to throw them off balance. And you need a way in, someone who knows how they operate." Holt glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. "You're talking about going in yourself." Victor hesitated. The thought of returning to the field, of facing the cartel head-on, made his stomach churn. But he knew the risks. He knew that this was the only way to stop them, once and for all. He'd walked away from that life before. But now, as he looked at the faces of the officers around him, all of them determined, all of them willing to do whatever it took, he knew he couldn't walk away again. Not this time. "I'll help," he said, his voice steady but low. "I'll give you the intel. But I'm not going in with a weapon. I'll be your eyes, your ears. I'll guide the team from the shadows." Holt nodded, a small, appreciative smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We need you, Victor. We've all seen what you're capable of. This isn't just about taking down the cartel. It's about cleaning up the department. We can't do it without you." Victor felt a weight settle on his chest as he thought about everything that had brought him to this point. He had never wanted to be part of this fight again. But now, it wasn't about his past or the ghosts that haunted him. It was about the future. About stopping the men who had destroyed everything. About making sure no one else would lose what he had lost. He glanced at the map again, the plan slowly forming in his mind. "We'll hit them hard, but we'll do it smart. No one gets left behind. We get in, we get out, and we shut them down." The night was cold and silent, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The task force was in position, their vehicles lined up just outside the warehouse. Victor stood beside the mobile command center, watching as the officers took their places. It was all coming together. The plan, the execution, the final push to dismantle the cartel's operations. Victor had been in situations like this before. He had led men into battle, had seen friends fall in the line of duty. But tonight, it felt different. Tonight, he wasn't just fighting for the people in front of him. He was fighting for his daughter, for the future he wanted to give her, for the promise he had made to never leave a fallen. As the task force moved in, Victor stayed in the command center, monitoring the operation from a distance. His eyes flicked over the screens, watching as the officers moved into position, their movements precise and calculated. They were ready. A few minutes later, the first explosions rang out, sending the sound of shattering glass and metal echoing through the night. The cartel had been expecting them, but the task force was better prepared. They had the element of surprise. Victor's mind raced as the operation unfolded, his eyes never leaving the screens. His role was simple: provide guidance, analyze the situation, and keep the team on track. But he knew that the moment they stepped through those doors, there would be no turning back. Inside the warehouse, the task force moved swiftly, their footsteps muffled by the heavy boots that carried them toward the heart of the cartel's operations. Victor's voice crackled over the radio, guiding them through the layout of the warehouse, pointing out escape routes and marking key targets. "Move left," Victor's voice echoed in their earpieces. "Watch the corners. They'll be waiting for you." As they entered the central room, they were met with resistance. Gunfire erupted, but the officers were quick, expertly using the cover of the warehouse's steel beams to their advantage. The air was thick with tension as the team advanced, the sound of shouting and gunfire growing louder. Victor's heart raced as he watched from the command center. He could hear the officers' voices over the radio, their calls for backup, their reports of injuries. But through it all, there was something that kept him focused: the knowledge that they were closing in on their target. The final push minutes felt like hours as the task force pushed deeper into the heart of the warehouse. Victor's voice guided them through every move, his strategic insight keeping them one step ahead of the cartel members. The sound of footsteps and gunfire echoed through the building, but they were closing in. In the back of the warehouse, they finally found what they were looking for: the financial hub of the cartel's operations, the documents, the money, the connections, everything they needed to bring down the cartel once and for all. The task force moved in, their guns trained on the cartel members who tried to escape. But Victor knew they couldn't let anyone slip through their fingers. Not now. By the time the sun began to rise, the warehouse had been secured. The task force had arrested dozens of cartel members, seized millions in cash and weapons, and shut down the financial operations that had kept the cartel alive for years. The operation had been a success, but for Victor, it wasn't over. He stood outside the warehouse, watching as the last of the officers loaded the cartel's leaders into the transport vehicles. His mind was still on Carla, still recovering in the hospital, and on Maria, who had no idea what her father had just been through. Victor's role had been crucial. He had provided the intel, guided the team through the most dangerous parts of the operation. But as the dust settled, the reality set in. This was just the beginning. The cartel was down, but the corruption within the department was still an ongoing threat. As the last of the officers left the scene, Holt approached him, his expression one of quiet respect. "You did it, Victor," Holt said, his voice low. "We did it. This city is safer tonight because of you." Victor looked at Holt, then at the task force officers who had stood by him throughout the night. He didn't want recognition. He didn't want to be a hero. But he knew that what they had accomplished tonight wasn't just about stopping the cartel. It was about showing the world that even in the darkest of times, there was always a way out. Later that week, Victor stood in front of a small group of civilians, his hands steady as he demonstrated CPR on a training dummy. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: nurses, teachers, parents, people who wanted to learn how to save a life. Maria sat in the back of the room, her eyes bright with pride. Victor smiled at her, knowing that this was the future he had promised her. It wasn't the life he had expected, but it was the life he had chosen. As he looked around the room, Victor realized that his purpose wasn't just about stopping the bad guys. It was about teaching people how to protect what mattered most. It was about giving them the tools they needed to survive. "You're not always going to be in the right place at the right time," Victor said, his voice calm but firm. "But when you are, you better be ready, because you never know who might need your help." If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.